I've said it many times before that I will rarely argue with someone who thinks China is a bad place, particularly with people who insist the Chinese people need to be rescued from their evil government. I usually have one simple question to ask these people, and if they can't answer it, I'll back off and I'll let them stew on their own thoughts. It's not worth arguing with anybody. My question to them is usually this: when was the last time you asked a person in China what they think of the Chinese government? And the simple answer is it's very rare. But there are people who can answer this positively and say, I've asked many people in China and I still disagree with you. Now, there's no doubt that that person has an opinion, and the reason I won't argue with them is because their opinion is based on their experiences, and their experiences differ to mine. We can both be right, or we could both be wrong. Therefore, there isn't much point in me telling someone who lives in China that the place is great when they disagree and they have experiences that prove to them, at least, that the place is not great. That's fair. Now, another example of someone else I wouldn't argue with is people like Kevin Rudd. And then there's someone I couldn't argue with, Stephen McDonnell. I'm 100% convinced both would disagree with me on almost every aspect of China, and if we were to debate the matter, Kevin Rudd, would throw example after example at me of how China is bad and how the people suffer there. And I could just as easily throw example after example at him about how the place is great and no one needs rescuing. The government is great for the vast majority of the people here. So how is it that we get these things so wrong or so different? And both we believe that we're right. Now, McDonnell, on the other hand, won't ever debate with anyone. The problem with debating people like Rudd is that they firmly believe they are correct, and they will provide evidence to support their belief. Debating people like Stephen McDonnell, the BBC's man in China, is a totally different kettle of fish. He knows he's lying, and he will never take on someone in a debate. He simply dismisses them, usually with an insult, and thereby proves to anyone who has seen his X or Twitter feed that he's not capable of forming a critical argument. Rudd is very different. Before coming to China, he was briefed and educated about China. He was once a diplomat working here, and that certainly gives him an insight. But before he ever arrived in China, he would have been thoroughly trained in what to expect and how the local officials will mislead him. In other words, he's constantly on his guard against misinformation. And when he hears something from a senior member of the Chinese government, and he would have met many of them, he will immediately disregard it as false, because that's what his training has led him to believe. Even when he regards something as true, he would misinterpret the motivation for it. For example, it's well known that China has built a huge military capacity. It's very easy, coming from a Western-trained standpoint, to look at that and assume that China is poised to do exactly what the most powerful military in the world has already done: invade some other countries. And that's a fair assumption, but it's a wrong assumption based on misinterpretation. When Xi Jinping, the man in command of that military, which is a perfectly normal position for a president of a huge country to be, remember, Biden, for all of his inabilities, is still the commander-in-chief. But when that person says China plans to defend its shores, it will not allow 1 inch to be taken away again, Westerners disregard this and assume he's planning an invasion of Taiwan. He isn't. He's planning the defense of Taiwan, which Kevin Rudd and billions of others inside and outside of China, even Stephen McDonnell must agree, is part of China, therefore quite acceptable to defend. Xi Jinping, for the record, has never once in any public forum, and probably never in a private one either, said he will invade Taiwan. Only the media say that. Like all Chinese leaders, politicians, media personalities, he wants Taiwan to be reunited with the mainland and will work diligently towards that. In fact, he's never said he wants to attack. This is interpreted by people like Rudd as he won't rule out an attack. This misinterpretation of a peaceful phrase is then filtered out to the media, politicians, and us, the gullible consumers, as some kind of threat, but one which has never ever been made. So how is it that people who know China, who live in China, and who have some degree of understanding of China all think that I'm wrong when I think that they're wrong? Now, most people watching me will know I live in China. I live in a very normal part of China. All my neighbors are Chinese. There isn't a Westerner living anywhere nearby in my street, on my block. There are no Western restaurants nearby. There's one Western bar not far away. I very rarely go there, but I can walk there in about 10 minutes. It's in the heart of downtown Zhongshan, which is where I live. So why is that important? There's a foreign community with several restaurants, bars, coffee shops, bakeries, and other places where I can find Western food, Western influences, and other Westerners. But it's 11 kilometers away, and I rarely go there. But when I do, I'll see many foreigners. 99% of them I don't know, and I'm fairly sure that they won't know me either. And this is important because it means most of the time when I'm with friends, they're Chinese friends. When I'm with family, they're Chinese family. When I'm working, which I rarely do nowadays, I work with Chinese people. And when I'm interacting with people through my social media, many of them, many of you, are also Chinese. Many Westerners, though, live in these bubbles of Western influence. They read and watch Western media. They mix with other Westerners, usually in China, on a posting here rather than long-term residence, and they form their opinions in the same way they would form their opinions in their home country. When academics come to China and study here, especially when they don't spend extended time here, they're exposed to a different kind of Chinese person to me. My exposures are to ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. I meet them in the streets, the shops, the factories, the small businesses. When an academic or a politician comes to China, they're taken on a managed tour of certain areas. They meet people of their own stature, other academics. If they do research, it's often on university campuses and researching with students who share their views. But long-term studies in China find different aspects. The Harvard Ash report of a few years ago was a welcome example. It took 13 years before Harvard Business Review published an article telling the world something I knew within a couple of weeks of living in China, that people here generally have a good impression of their government. And that impression has improved over time and has now reached well over 90%. They don't need rescue. Why then do these experts like Kevin Rudd disagree with me? It's all because of his experience. He speaks Chinese. He did live in China. He's actually had some Chinese members of his own family. So I'm not picking on Kevin Rudd specifically because he's done anything to annoy me. I just think he's wrong on China generally. In fact, I was a supporter of his in Queensland, although I didn't vote for him as I lived in a different electorate. I would have done if I was living in his area. I was a supporter of his move to pull Australia out of the Gulf War. That was something he was very much in favour of going into, but only because he, like the rest of us, had been convinced by US lies that Saddam Hussein was in possession of weapons of mass destruction. When Colin Powell admitted that it wasn't true, Rudd was Prime Minister by then, and he immediately pulled Australia out of Iraq. Coincidentally, in a move that surprised a lot of people, he was removed from office by his deputy, who was more favourable to the US war machine. Coincidence? I don't think so. I happen to think that Kevin Rudd is wrong on most things about China. He writes and speaks often about how Xi Jinping is thinking, and to be honest, I don't think that's at all possible, because analysing Xi's work, which is written in several books, and I have 5 of them, and then reading Rudd's comments seem to relate to 2 different people. Kevin Rudd is not lying. He's interpreting Xi's thoughts and opinions, and he's interpreting them as he would like himself to be interpreted, through a Western lens. Kevin Rudd's body of work on China started with a thesis on a Chinese dissident when he was a student. That's a telling indication that his original study of China was in a negative light. He also studied in Taiwan, and when he served in the diplomatic corps, he would have received briefings from the intelligence community. One of his roles was to analyze Chinese defense spending. He served in Beijing under Ross Garnaut. He's an economist who to this day is still writing about China's economic and climate collapse, as well as David Irvin, who went on to be the head of ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization. Now, as Rudd is now the ambassador to the US, it's important to note that the Australian government is being advised by people such as these, who they trust implicitly because of the experience they have. But that experience is not in the same China as me. Their experience is in a different place to the China where I live. Now, this is going to sound strange, but bear with me while I explain. Despite living inside the borders of China, none of these people have actually lived in China. They would have had very large salaries, allowing them to eat and drink in places patronized only by the wealthy elites. They would have sent their children, if they had any, to international schools, again patronized by foreigners and wealthy Chinese. They would have lived in gated communities with security guards where the elites live, and they would have traveled to and from work probably with cars and drivers. They would have met with politicians, academics, business leaders, other diplomats, and any interaction with ordinary Chinese people would be as staff, maybe housekeepers, waiters, and drivers. It's highly unlikely that any of these people have sat outside their local convenience store or eaten at a street-side barbecue or got on a bike and cycled through a rural town in a remote province. Ambassador Nicholas Barnes of the USA is a great example. He travels first class on high-speed trains, something Kevin Rudd wouldn't have had the opportunity to do, as they weren't built when he served in China. Nicholas Burns is picked up by an embassy driver and driven to places the embassy have arranged for him to see. And he posts about it on Twitter all the time. But I've never seen him with his sleeves rolled up, sitting on a plastic stool, drinking a Qingdao beer from the bottle, which is what Chinese people do. Another difference between these people and me: I've never been briefed by Western intelligence organizations. I was never told to ignore everything the Chinese government or media tells me as propaganda. But as my wife likes to remind me, I did believe that for a long time. What my media was telling me must be true. What Chinese media was telling me was not true. Now, these things changed. Two things changed for me. One was doing a lot of in-depth quantitative research, that is, questionnaires to a large number of Chinese people, and qualitative research, which means interviewing a lot of people. Every single one of them was a Chinese business leader, and they were in China. And that was for my master's degree, which I did while I was here in Zhongshan a little over 10 years ago. The other thing for me was traveling to places where foreigners don't go, but are welcome and free to travel. Places like Xinjiang, which in 2014 surprised me by being completely open to me riding a bike around it, from one end in the east to the other end in the west. And while doing so, meeting with and finding out that even there, in Xinjiang, where I'd been informed there were all kinds of human rights abuses going on, there was nothing of the sort. Now, I'd challenge Nicholas Burns or Kevin Rudd or any other Western diplomat to China to wander into the town center of Dabachang, which is a small town near Urumqi, and ask about the camps. Apparently, if ASPI are to be believed, the biggest of them is just outside the city, and you pass it by driving on the main road from there towards Urumqi. Except what you see is quite normal for a city of any size. There's a prison there. It's not hidden. It's right there by the road. And I challenge any diplomat who has a problem with this to show me a city in their home country that doesn't have a prison. Australia, for example, with a population around the same size as Xinjiang, has over 150 prisons according to Wikipedia. So, when I want to know something about China, I simply ask Chinese people. When these experts want to know anything about China, they look for something that confirms what they're thinking. They ask their peers and sometimes the Chinese diaspora, some of whom have never even lived in China. And let's talk about them for a moment. One of them is Gordon Chang. Why do so many of them hate China so much? Why does Gordon Chang get things so badly wrong? He's lived and worked in China himself. He has a Chinese father. It's because of what happened to his father. A lot of people left China when the communists won the Civil War. Gordon's father left before the Second World War, but stayed in the USA because he didn't want to return to communist China. Now think of this, a New Jersey boy with Chinese blood and a father who hated communists. And this is why you have people like him getting China so wrong. He's struggling to see past his beliefs, and to this day, communists, to him, can't possibly be doing something right. A lot of those people left during the Cultural Revolution. That's understandable. It was a time of chaos, fear, oppression for many people. Now, some of them would have snuck out earlier during the blockaded years, which led to the Great Famine, this great leap forward. And that's one that the West insists, where Mao killed 30 million of his own people, but actually where life expectancy and the population both grew. That's not to say there wasn't a famine, there most certainly was, but Mao didn't cause that. We're just told by the same people who told us that weapons of mass destruction were in Iraq that he did do that. These people would have children and grandchildren now, the diaspora. Those kids have grown up with the horror stories from their parents and grandparents. So much so that, like most of the Tibetan diaspora, they've never set foot in the country of their heritage. They've never seen how the place has developed or how happy the people here are. But they hate the place, or at least they hate the people they think are destroying the place. No one ever goes to Tibet and asks the people there. All the academics who want information about Tibet ask Tibetans in Washington. Those that do travel to Tibet, like I have a very different perception. Robert Barnett, we should read his books, for example. He understands far more of the nuances of Tibet than I ever will. As Kevin Rudd and Gordon Chang so often exemplify, experts give opinions based on their experience. If that experience is flawed, then so is their opinion. It's human nature to assess what others' thoughts might be and what actions they might take based on how we would act under the same stimuli. The problem is, those flawed opinions from those foreign experts who look at China through a different lens are leading us towards a conflict when proper advice might take a different path. Those experts who do spend extended time researching, as the Harvard Ash Center did, as the University of California, San Diego did, as the Edelman Trust Barometer does every year, they form very different opinions. These opinions are dismissed by government senior advisors as being flawed because they offer a different opinion. The Global Happiness Index listed China as the happiest country in the world. The Edelman Trust Barometer says that China has the most trust in both their government and their media. These are valid research papers, and they're dismissed as propaganda, despite coming from highly trusted bodies with tried and tested methodologies. Because, in the opinion of some so-called experts, Chinese people can't be trusted to give an honest answer to a survey. But what's really strange to me is that all those institutions, the ones which spend time and money in China learning what Chinese people think, what Chinese people want, and how Chinese people act, they all seem to come to the same conclusions as me. China is an open, transparent country. They operate under a rule of law where crimes are punished, the corrupt are removed, and people have a strong say in how their country is managed, as well as a very high approval of the people doing the management, the CPC. It's impossible to say, I love China and the Chinese people but dislike the CCP, and then be taken seriously by anyone in China, because those people would firmly remind you, if you're talking to someone in China, there's a better than 1 in 12 chance that the person you're talking to is a member of the party you're disparaging. That person might be a factory worker, a security guard, a taxi driver, a government official. It can even be a student. That's how deeply embedded in society the party is. And anyone who is an expert on China would know this. Experts might be in their title. It might be what people call them. But but they sure as heck are not experts in knowing what Chinese people are thinking. If they were, they'd be getting it right from time to time instead of getting it wrong every time. And as for the people who tell me, oh, I've lived in Shanghai, Beijing, or wherever else they lived, and loved China but hated the CCP, I challenge them that they've never lived in China. They've lived in what I call the Sanlitun bubble. International friends, international food, international shops, international bars, international schools for their kids, weekends in Hong Kong or somewhere else to get out of China for a while. When you live like this, it's very easy to live inside China's borders without ever actually setting foot in the real China. And people like this do that. They don't know China. There are some of these so-called experts, and many of them make a decent living in media and on social media, who are just straight outliers, though. They're the people I don't want to argue with. And that's it from me about the expert opinions. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time. Thanks very much for joining me tonight. And please don't forget that like, share, and subscribe. But really, the share. Get the shares in. That's what I'd like most. Thanks for that. See you.